This is Jonathan Slater. Welcome to Tête-à-Tête, Conversations in Canadian Jewish Studies. I have something a bit different from our usual dialogue fare for you this month, more of a monologue actually. It's a reflection by my colleague David Koffman. I've invited David onto the show to share a version of an essay he published earlier this summer in the Shalom Hartman Institute's award-winning journal, Sources, a journal of Jewish ideas. I found David's piece compelling, so I thought it would be a good idea to use this podcast to have David engage with Canadians about ways Jewish life has been changing over these past few months, these past few years, and even decades. David's reflection is titled Two Inward Turns, Canadian Jews Since Multiculturalism, Since October 8th, and Since Trump's Annexationist Threat. David, who's the J. Richard Shiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry at York University, is not only a colleague, noted author, scholar, and educator, he's editor-in-chief of the ACJS's flagship journal, Canadian Jewish Studies, Age of Multiculturalism, and the publisher of our new Canadian Jewish literary journal, Parchment. David also happens to be one of the two executive producers of this podcast. We're recording this one in early September. The Jewish High Holy Days are upon us. The days of awe are a window of time for soul-searching on both an individual level and collectively as a community. It's the perfect moment to share David's meditation on what used to be the comfortable realities of Canadian Jewish existence and on the ways those realities have increasingly been challenged, even disrupted by events and historical trends inside and outside Canada. As you'll hear, David argues that while Jews in Canada continue to carry on communal life largely in the ways they have in the past, developments at home and abroad have left Canadian Jewish communities feeling unsettled, to say the least. But David's piece is more than another kvetch about how bad things feel for Canadian Jews. He has a call, and he offers a vision. You can agree with or disagree with it, of course. For my part, I just feel a refreshing optimism in his writing. I'm eager for people to talk more, head to head, heart to heart, and yes, tête-à-tête. Just to have important conversations in Canadian Jewish studies. Before we turn it over to David, though, I wanted to introduce you to Claire Sufrin, the Director of Research and Publication at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America and the editor of Sources. Claire, hello. Thanks for joining me.
Jonathan, it's wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
Claire, I've asked you here to share a few words for our Canada Forward audience about David's piece in your magazine, Sources. Sources is one of the most important venues for Jewish thought leadership in the diaspora today, but David's essay might be the first and only piece in Sources that has any CanCon. Claire, can you set up what our listeners are about to hear and maybe share a word about what to listen for or why it's important?
Sure, I'm happy to. And I'll start first with just a little bit more about the journal. So Sources is published by the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America 3 times a year in both print and digital formats. And listeners can find it at sourcesjournal.org. We aim to advance and deepen the Jewish conversation. So we publish articles by scholars, rabbis, and others that bring new perspectives on the questions that matter to North American Jews. We've been around since 2021, but you're right that David's piece is the first essay to focus squarely on Canadian Jewry. The theme of the summer 2025 issue, where it appears, is community. And though David has long been on my list of potential authors, this theme is an especially good fit for his expertise and interests. So I'll give you a little bit of the backstory. My assignment to David was twofold. First, about 70% of our readers are in the United States, and I wanted an article that would educate them about the unique history and situation of Canadian Jewry, which is really not that well known here. Second, and more importantly, I wanted a piece that would speak directly to Canadian readers and use their history to offer them a constructive vision for the present and immediate future. I'll go ahead and tell you, I think David's essay goes above and beyond in fulfilling the assignment. It's an A+ all the way. And I'm pleased to say that it's among the most read articles of this issue. Historians aren't always great at offering constructive visions. They'll say, the past is my period, not the future. But David really succeeds at understanding Canadian Jewish history, identifying the strengths of the community, and articulating a vision that is realistic and hopeful, just like you said. For me, as an American Jew, I also find inspiration in his defense of centrism as a strength. It's a lesson that I think all of us, wherever we are, need to consider.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was very flattering, and thank you, Jonathan, for inviting me onto the show.
David, I just have one accusation. That is, you, in the title of your piece, you have used one word, which from a audio standpoint, from a speaking standpoint, annexationist. I had to practice that. I don't know how many times so that I wouldn't fall over my own tongue. No, I'm just having fun with you. But that word is not a natural word.
You know, I'm going to read the piece, but when I, read it once in practice before doing the show,
Yeah.
it was like, wait a second, this piece is really written for the page, and I'm going to have to rework it so that I can sound
Yeah.
a little more
Yeah.
natural.
Anyhow,
So here we go.
that wins the word of the month prize. Annexation.
Canadian Jewish life has changed slowly over the course of my lifetime. I'm 52 now, dramatically since October 2023, and possibly most sharply and surprisingly since the start of Trump's second term in office south of the border. I sometimes think about the 1980s and early 90s in which I came of age as a kind of golden age for Canadian Jewry. Anti Semitism back then was weak and very rarely interrupted our daily lives. We saw our aunts and uncles and cousins reaching peak levels of social acceptance and visibility in Canada's Wall Street. It's called Bay Street here in Toronto. That's the city in which I grew up and now live in again, and the one from which I'm recording today. And in places like Parliament Hill in Ottawa and all of the central addresses of Canadian culture coast to coast. In big cities like Toronto and Montreal, the community boasted a near complete institutional landscape, meaning there were cradle to grave Jewish options for nearly every aspect of life. Canada had a much lower intermarriage rate than the US did, and there were very high levels of Jewish engagement, measured by things like synagogue membership, summer camp attendance, trips to Israel, some knowledge of Hebrew, and donation making to federations and other Jewish organizations. That communal confidence shaped my personal but largely unconscious understanding of what it meant to be both a Canadian Jew and a part of the global Jewish people. My baseline sensibility towards what I figured the Canadian Jewish future would be was that we were basically valued citizens, but kind of unremarkable as Jews. Kind of had the best of both worlds. We were free to live Jewishly, unmolested by exclusion, by the non Jewish mainstream, and free to make whatever sorts of Jewish choices felt right for us as individuals, free to participate fully in Canada's open society. Now, it's really interesting for me to think about it now that during my undergraduate studies in Montreal, during my time in the documentary film world in Toronto, while I was studying at yeshiva in Jerusalem, and even throughout my graduate school years studying modern Jewish history in New York, I paid very little attention to my Canadianness, let alone my Canadian Jewishness. Well, all that changed when I moved back to the city of my childhood about 15, 16 years ago and pivoted my scholarly career to focus squarely on Jewish history in Canada. Looking backward from today, in the wake of so many dramatic changes we've been witnessing in the recent weeks and months and even years, I see that sense of Canadian Jewish stability deeply unsettled and confused and anxious. I'm talking about the apparent collapse of the American project as we knew it, a new disorder that's been wrought upon the neoliberal global order that we thought was unmovable just a few years ago, the terrible gut punch of October 2023, and of course, all of its devastating and ongoing aftermaths. And from a Canadian perspective, the rise of Trump's mocking and menacing annexationist rhetoric and the seismic tariff battles. That's really quite a lot, and quite reasonably, it's making everyone up here anxious and confused. But right off the bat, I wanted to signal that my own sense of things right now is less despondent than it could be. I actually see this time we're struggling through as one of great opportunity. I'll come back to this in a bit. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I edited a book that was published for Canada's sesquicentennial. It was meant as a celebration of the idea of Canada as a home for the Jews, but, a critical celebration, something like a cerebration. I invited 17 scholars, some Canadian Jewish Studies scholars, and some Jewish Studies scholars who had never written about Canada before, but were either from here or lived here. And I asked them to use one question as a point of departure. Has there ever been a better home for the Jews than Canada? Now, this is a decidedly non-academic question, and one that I don't think can really be properly answered. And I didn't mean for the contributors to answer it directly. It was enough to just float the possibility that perhaps, yes, Canada might just be offering the very best of what diaspora could or has offered to Jews, maybe ever. The book was designed to gain attention for the world's fourth largest Jewish community, which is likely to become the third, overtaking France probably within a generation. Canadian Jewry gets relatively little attention from the global Jewish world, and my professional mandate is to help it get more. Now, had the book been conceived after October 2023 rather than before 2017, it would have been a little different. My colleagues' analyses are still brilliant and very much relevant, but something of the tone of the volume as a whole, its subtext, has shifted given the shift in context. The book is now an artifact of both an earlier historical moment that's now gone and an artifact that betrays an editor's temperament that had been forged in the Jewish 1980s. Now, Canada itself, of course, has changed over the past 40 or 50 years. We're now far more ethnically and religiously diverse than we were in the 70s or 80s. Our national identity is far less culturally British, and our institutions are no longer quite as dominated by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male elites as they were then. We've also moved beyond old preoccupations with constitutional wrangling and Quebec separatism, though there's now rumbling about Alberta separatism in the air, where Canadians once saw themselves as a nation of two founding peoples, English Protestants and French Catholics, what sometimes is referred to as the two solitudes. We now consider our country the product of what historian Peter Russell calls a story of incomplete conquest. For most, Canada is now a country of 4 different constituencies: Anglophones, Francophones, Indigenous peoples, and then this partly absorbed motley crew of minorities who have retained a good deal of their cultural uniqueness, even as they have partly blended with the other 3. Canadian perceptions of Israel have been shifting too, at least since the 1982 Lebanon War. Starting in the 70s, Canada began welcoming many more immigrants from around the world. At that time, Arab Canadian lobbying efforts emerged in earnest. The pro-Palestinian movement grew steadily from then on in Canada, gaining steam in academia, grassroots organizing, churches, and solidarity networks. Immigrant communities who came to Canada later than most Jews had, often a generation or even 2 afterwards, well, they began applying political pressure at various levels of government. These minorities' potential votes helped solidify Canada's foreign policy posture as that of the honest broker, a posture that was and basically remains explicitly supportive of Israel, and at the same time, one that hoped to play a role in good faith efforts at successful negotiations with the Palestinians. That stance, that honest broker stance, worked just fine for left of center and for centrist Jews and for liberal Zionists, people who hoped for a 2-state solution and thought that the values driving Canada's domestic and foreign policy should be congruent. That honest broker position, though, alarmed Canada's right-of-center Jews, who were empowered during that same time by Orthodox Jews and a large secular population of Holocaust survivors' children, who saw this so-called honest broker position as, just so much fickle equivocation, and therefore fundamentally dangerous to Jewish interests. Well, it's worth noting that Canadian Jews are disproportionately descended from survivors. In Canada, it's about 18% of the Jewish population, compared with maybe 3 or 4% of the United States. And this has profoundly shaped our communal psychology. And this shift in Canada's attitude towards Israel-Palestine matters for Canadian Jews, because Zionism was, at least for a time, the earliest and stickiest of glues that united Jews across towns, cities, and provinces. Now, it's a bit ironic, but in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Jews from across the very wide geography that's north of the 49th parallel were first made into Canadian Jews by their shared commitment not to Canadian Confederation, but to the idea of a Jewish national home elsewhere. In contrast to American Jews at this time, Canadian Jews faced less of a dual loyalty problem because Canada was a binational state, like, say, Belgium or South Africa, two countries which also happen to have seen very strong Zionist commitments, stronger than those of the US or the UK at the time. Jews in binational countries, like Canada, didn't have to pledge allegiance to one single ethnoculture to be considered good citizens, though of course many saw the wisdom of doing so. A recent poll in the journal that I edit, Canadian Jewish Studies, Études Juives Canadiennes, by the sociologist Bob Brim, showed that most non-Jewish Canadians now report having warm and positive attitudes towards Jews and Judaism, but about half of those non-Jewish Canadians expressed negative views of Israel. This is a gap that many Jews see as intrinsically anti-Semitic, but many non-Jews insist is not. Now, this wasn't particularly surprising to me, but I was quite disturbed to learn from this survey data that more Canadians, just numerically speaking, openly attest to having explicitly anti-Semitic attitudes than the raw number of Jews in this country. This research and other recent social science research have revealed that Zionism is no longer that sturdy glue binding Canadian Jews together. As you well know, it's actually become a lightning rod for intra-Jewish division. Now, for decades, as networks of solidarity strengthened among Black, Indigenous, and other visible minority Canadians, including Arab and most Muslim Canadians, Canadian Jewish communal resources increasingly flowed away from what was once called community relations, and we now call allyship. Instead, we invested in what we can think of as vertical alliances, efforts to forge strong ties with police chiefs, university presidents, members of parliament, and members of provincial parliaments, and other officials. Now, this strategy certainly made good sense at the time. Jews were entering the highest echelons of power and elite institutions and had more access to officials for the first time in 20th century Canadian history. But the focus on vertical alliances came at the expense of what we might think of as horizontal ones. Connections with labor unions, teachers' federations, municipal councils, churches, temples, mosques, and, grassroots organizations. And so we arrive at today's condition. Canadian Jews are politically enfranchised, but socially estranged. Powerful in official circles, but uncertain of our neighbors. There are a bunch of additional important transformations in Canadian Jewish history that have taken place over the last generation and a half. The first is demographic. So, a quarter of Jewish Canadians today are themselves or are the children of newer Jewish immigrants. We're about 10% Sephardi, with significant numbers from Morocco, Syria, Turkey, Egypt, and elsewhere. About 6.5% former Soviet from a dozen different countries, but mostly Russia and Ukraine. About 6% Israel-born, and a healthy smattering of Jews from Central Europe, from the US, from Southern Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. We are, in other words, much more of a community of diasporas than we were even 2 generations ago. This matters, I think, not simply because diversity has enriched our Jewish cultural ecology, which of course it has, and of course that's a blessing. It's vital to understand that many of the parents of today's young Jewish adults, maybe 50,000 people in a population of around 400,000, came here to rebuild lives, safe, secure, strong lives, after fleeing various failed experiments in the modern Jewish diasporic existence. Economic ruin, authoritarian rule, civil war, the collapse of communism, apartheid, intifada, and other forms of violence or wreckage. The legacy of these difficult pre-migration lives profoundly shapes this very sizable eighth of Canadian Jews today. The second transformation has been geographic. The center of Canadian Jewish gravity shifted from Montreal to Toronto in the aftermath of Quebec's Quiet Revolution, which happened exactly at the same time that Toronto began replacing Montreal as Canada's most powerful economic city. Montreal Jewishness had, for decades, operated on what we might call a third solitude model, where Jews had to navigate the space between French Catholics and Quebecois secularists on the one hand, and Anglo-Protestants on the other. The shift to Toronto, which was much more of a polyglot and more multicultural city at the time, required Jews to navigate between WASP elites and a more diverse set of non-WASP groups. Bear in mind today that about half of Canada's Jews live in the Greater Toronto area. The third transformation is religious, because over the past generation, the Orthodox segment of Canadian Jewry has grown significantly numerically, as well as politically and economically and culturally, a whole spectrum from modern Orthodox Jews to various Haredi groups. Orthodox Jews today are much better organized, funded, and visible than they were 50 years ago. Their rise has both enriched our communal landscape and has challenged the older political order. It's given greater voice to ideologies and practices that were once peripheral to mainstream Canadian Jewish life. The fourth and last internal transformation among Canadian Jews concerns institutions. And the big story here is that Canadian Jewish Congress, or the CJC, which was founded in 1919 and was for a long time the central address for Canadian Jewish political life, collapsed in 2011 after nearly 75 years at the center of Canadian Jewish political life. Its demise was hastened by a combination of internal disputes, controversial governance changes, and financial withdrawal by Federation and the Federation system. Rising in the place of Congress was CIJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, which is technically independent from federations but is basically its instrument. This transformation from the Congress model to the CIJA model signaled what I think is a profound change in how the national Jewish community organized itself, from one that was a grassroots up democracy of sorts to one focused on cultivating strategic top-down relationships with political elites. Now, unfortunately, I can't point you to any scholarly accounting or even a decent long-form journalistic account of this really important shift. There just haven't been any written yet. But the effects of this transformation are everywhere. Canadian Jews today have less internal governance structure and less capacity than we did even 15 years ago. We've actually lost many of the forums for collective voice and for internal debate that we had just a generation ago. biggest change to Canadian Jewish life over my lifetime, however, unlike the four important ones I just mentioned, is not one that's internal to the Jewish experience. It's an ideological transformation of Canada at large.
Hey there, I'm Joshua Tapper, the Executive Director of the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies and one of the producers of this podcast. I hope you've been enjoying David's reading of his essay on the current Canadian Jewish moment, and I hope too that you'll check out the print version, which was published this past summer in Sources, the Shalom Hartman Institute's Journal of Jewish Ideas. Before we get back to David, I want to share a bit about the ACJS, which, if you didn't already know, is the world's leading organization dedicated to advancing public knowledge on the Jewish experience in Canada. We've been in business for just about half a century, a time in which our diverse and multidisciplinary community of scholars, archivists, artists, students, and Jewish community leaders have helped ensure that all Canadians have access to and can engage with the amazing, colorful tapestry of Canada's Jewish culture, heritage, and history. This is an incredibly exciting time at the ACJS. In addition to the programs and projects we've always excelled at, like our annual Scholars Conference, which, by the way, is taking place in Toronto next year, stay tuned for more on that, and our academic journal, which published its 40th volume back in May, we're taking a big step forward with a variety of other initiatives. In 2026, we'll launch a brilliant new website that combines digital mapping tools and interactive family trees to tell the story of the first Jewish families to arrive in pre-Confederation Canada. We'll also release the first volume of Parchment, the only literary journal devoted entirely to contemporary Canadian Jewish fiction and poetry. We'll also announce a memoir writing project that will collect and publish life stories of Jewish Canadians from all walks of life, launch a speakers bureau that brings together smart and dynamic presenters with insights to share about Jewish Canada, and sponsor an array of public events in both English and French, and that's just scratching the surface. There are many ways for you to follow along and engage with our work, and we hope you'll do so. Scroll down to the show notes for links to the association's website and to sign up for our newsletter, where we'll keep you informed about what we've got going on and feature exclusive content that takes you deeper into the world of Canadian Jewish studies. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast. We hope you'll join us on this important journey to increase awareness, understanding, and appreciation of the Jewish experience in Canada across time and space. In the meantime, Shana Tova from all of us here at the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. And now, back to the show.
So, multiculturalism, which was the ideological baseline of Canadian self-understanding when I was growing up, has quietly retreated. In its place have risen two key ideological and policy frameworks: equity, diversity, and inclusion, EDI, on the one hand, and Indigenous reconciliation on the other. Sometimes you'll hear in Canada these two referred to as one thing, DEDI, or decolonization plus EDI. Well, these frameworks present really significant new challenges for Canadian Jews. Challenges that I think are far more complicated than multiculturalism itself ever was. Multiculturalism had emerged nationwide as the federal government's response to Quebecers' push to advance what they called biculturalism, which was itself an outgrowth of Quebec's protectionist efforts at having their distinct society properly recognized by the rest of the country. Multiculturalism sought to turn the begrudging fact of diversity on the ground into a cultural asset. It was a pluralism initiative that was born of the progressive politics of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the father of the recent former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and by the activism of organized minority communities. It's worth noting that when multiculturalism first took root in Canada in the 1970s, Canadian Jewish organizations were pretty ambivalent about it. The Canadian Jewish Congress initially resisted it, preferring to frame Jews as a religious minority alongside the other two big ones, the Protestants and the Catholics, rather than frame Jews as just one of many ethnic minorities, like the Ukrainians and the Italians, Indians, Chinese, Filipinos, and dozens of other immigrant communities. Despite this initial lukewarm reaction to multiculturalism, most Canadian Jews got onboarded thoroughly. As an ideology and as a practice, multiculturalism became the cornerstone of Jewish security and pride. Under multiculturalism, federal dollars funded Jewish newspapers, archives, museums, and university Jewish studies programs like the one I teach in. This arrangement worked for Canadian Jews because it prized cultural pluralism and it suited the Jewish community's desire to be both distinct from others and simultaneously included and celebrated in the larger whole. Canadian Jews took a lot of pride in contrasting Canada's mosaic model with the United States' melting pot model, believing that Canada's approach was more humane and just better for the Jews. And during the heyday of multiculturalism, Canadian Jews achieved their greatest successes, their deepest enfranchisement, and most social acceptance, more achievements than they had during any other period of Canadian history. But multiculturalism had its shortcomings and its critics among other citizens. It helped many ethnic minorities that had been seen as just provisionally white only a generation earlier, but it didn't work nearly as well for a lot of newer Canadians. Though immigration had widened massively in the decade or so before multiculturalism, communities of East Asians and South Asians, of people from the Caribbean and Africa, and many others didn't see as much of multiculturalism's upside because they hadn't been around long enough to have built the community infrastructure that was needed to take full advantage of its downstream financial flows. And it wasn't just the money. Multiculturalism's tacit approach to racism was the hope that mutual respect would make racism just disappear, rather than dealing with it head on, systematically, or through direct policy. But of course, racism didn't disappear, not at all. And so newer Canadians pushed back. Some said that their communities were actually hurt by multiculturalism, since practically speaking, some communities benefited while they saw fewer gains. Multiculturalism had in effect created an escalator for some immigrant groups, but not all. And these newer and less white minorities also wanted to tackle racism and inequality using the new legal tools that Canada created only in 1982, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was part of the landmark Constitution Act. Yep, you heard me. Canada didn't get a constitution until I was 9. That was 1982. These minorities reasoned that the Charter was a sharper tool than the more, touchy-feely heritage policies of multiculturalism. And a third major shortcoming of multiculturalism was that it didn't address Indigenous issues. Today, multiculturalism is largely dead in practice, if not in name. It has been superseded, and in the minds of its strongest opponents, it's been corrected by the emergence of both EDI and Indigenous reconciliation as the dominant ideological paradigms for Canada of today. Both of these frameworks center anti-racism and the experiences of historically marginalized and racialized groups, Black Canadians, Indigenous peoples, and newer, mostly racialized immigrant communities. These two paradigms promote a pluralism that's focused on equity rather than equality. Both emphasize the virtues of raising up the lowest in society, and both rightly recognize that class, poverty, and access to shared national resources are really important elements in the equation, not just ethnicity. And fairly or unfairly, proponents of EDI do not see Jews as equity-seeking, since today's Jewish community does not face systemic barriers to accessing opportunities in things like employment or education or other social services. Jews have equal access to these things already. We're not disadvantaged in this sense. Okay, so equity, not equality, is now the lodestar. The shift here was from promoting cultural celebration to remedying systemic disparities. And in this reframing, Jews are often seen as successful or even privileged, relatively speaking, and thus outside the scope of EDI's concern. For many years, some Jewish leaders had worked hard to integrate Jewish concerns into EDI frameworks, emphasizing that Jews were othered just like other minorities, that Jews have their own intramural and intersectional racial diversity, right? We have Ashkenazim and Sephardim and Mizrahim and Asian Jews and Black Jews and Latino Jews. And they've argued that persistent anti-Semitism should simply require that Jews be as cared for as other vulnerable groups. But other Jews over the past decade recoiled from EDI altogether, seeing it as a movement that's indifferent to or even hostile to Jewish concerns, particularly when it comes to Jewish identity attachments to Zionism and Israel. And of course, October 7th intensified these divides among Jews. For many, EDI spaces that had been previously notionally open, though rarely welcoming, suddenly became sites of explicit exclusion. Jewish inclusion in progressive coalitions was revealed to be far more conditional than many had assumed. Jews had been welcomed as white allies, but not as significantly different or valued in their own right. Indigenous reconciliation has a long and really interesting and really important history, and is about Indigenous people first and foremost. And forgive me for being reductionist here, but reconciliation basically sorted Canadians into two categories. On the one hand, Indigenous people, including 634 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Those are people who trace their origins to mixed and marginalized communities of French and First Nation ancestors from their traditional homelands in Manitoba and Ontario. And on the other, the second category, settlers, or people who are simply not Indigenous to what's now called Canada. Some thinkers advocate for a third category between Indigenous and settler. They're called guests, a category that includes non-Indigenous people who understand that their place in Canada is part of a settler history, but are generally committed to being allies of Indigenous people. Indigenous resistance and resurgence have had as long and as complex a history as the very real and very damaging history of colonialism in Canada. But reconciliation only emerged as a paradigm for Canadian identity more broadly, and as a widely embraced civic care project in the wake of the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2012. The Commission's report included 94 recommendations for transforming Canadian society to try to reverse many of the terrible effects of Canada's colonial past. In contrast to the US, where the national conversation about race and racism has really marginalized Native Americans, in Canada, Indigenous politics and culture and inclusion are absolutely central. Over the past 10 or 15 years, most non-Haredi Canadian Jews have engaged in some way with reconciliation efforts. Jews have tended to articulate their empathy with Indigenous people in particularly Jewish ways, seeing parallels between two different histories of dispossession and oppression. But tensions about the stakes of this engagement were already simmering among Jews even before October 7th. Some Canadian Jews, particularly those for whom Jewish identity commitments were fundamentally anchored in Israel and its reputation in the world, well, they worried that reconciliation's language of settler colonialism could be turned against Zionism and against Jews. Accepting a, oversimplified moral mathematics of the Indigenous settler binary made many Canadian Zionists uneasy, because many non-Jews began deploying this same binary in conversations about Israel-Palestine at exactly the same time. As you all know, after October 7th, those fears exploded into the open. Some activists yoke their talk about decolonization to the eradication of Israel as a Jewish state. In the year and a half since then, Canadian Jews have found themselves caught in a terrible spot that's frankly a bit different from the spot of other non-Indigenous Canadians. Jews want to support Indigenous reconciliation within Canada, but also need to confront the weaponization of decolonization rhetoric against their fellow Jews abroad. It's tempting to say that October 7th changed everything, and in some ways it did. The feelings of insecurity, the wondering whether our vertical alliances with political elites will truly protect us, that feeling of abandonment, and the questioning of whether our horizontal neighbors actually like us. These affective crises all feel shockingly new, especially for Canadian Jews born after World War II. Anti-Semitic incidents have skyrocketed at staggering rates. It's truly horrifying. But thinking about this question with my professional historian's hat on, I find myself a little wary. We know that traumas can feel transformative in the moment, only to see that over time, much of the basic structure of life remains exactly as it was. There's a French literary theorist named Maurice Blanchot who I loved. He captured this paradox well in a book that he wrote about the Holocaust, a very great trauma. The book's called The Writing of the Disaster. And he wrote, "The disaster changes everything, all the while leaving everything intact." From my historian's perspective, I'd say that it's frankly still too soon to say whether October 7th and its aftermath have fundamentally reordered Jewish life in Canada, despite the very real emergence of a new form of hatred and more bigotry and more exclusion that suddenly appears everywhere and seems, at least to most Canadian Jews, to have become socially acceptable. Canadian Jews are traumatized, rocked by a tidal wave of fear and anger and grief. But trauma, I want to point out, is not the same thing as structural change. I'm thinking about Jews' actual standing in society. In terms of important fundamental things like legislation, policy, socioeconomic standing, and much of our embeddedness in Canadian society, well, most of what was true on October 6, 2023, remains true today in September 2025. It's true that it's much harder these days for some Jews to be out and proud, at least in certain sectors of Canadian society, like humanities departments in some universities or social workspaces or in literary and artistic circles. But we should bear in mind that Jews are still getting mortgages and jobs, still receiving acceptance letters to university programs, still freely associating in communal and public spaces, still experiencing fair treatments in courts and in elections, and as business people and in vacation spots and on playing fields. We're generally living good lives, although of course we have a lot more stress. What has shifted, and I think profoundly so, is the social psychology of Canadian Jews. Our older assumptions about safety, trust, acceptance, and solidarity have been wounded. Our optimism, though always cautious, given the fact that we have so many descendants of Holocaust survivors in our communities and our leadership, well, this has given way to new anxieties. The negative consequences of this affective turn are obvious, but there are some positive consequences to it that people who work in Jewish organizations will say privately. Look, synagogue attendance is up. More Jewish parents are enrolling their children in day schools. Job applications to Jewish organizations are rising. And the work of cultivating Jewish identity over social media is actually booming. And even if much of it is polarizing and rancorous, it still signals an intensification of engagement. It's obvious now more than it was even just 2 Rosh Hashanahs ago that Jews care deeply about their communities and their identities and their stories and their destinies as Jews. Since October 2023, my own professional and psycho-emotional posture has certainly shifted too. Like many Jewish studies professors I know, I've taken on an additional job. I've become more deliberate, more public-facing, and more strategic in my articulations of Jewish history and experience in Canada. I've tried to help steer my own university's senior administration, colleagues in various offices, and off-campus party who are keenly interested in what happens on campus on a good path as we confront anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I have purposefully chosen to focus on de-escalation strategies and paths to deepening learning. The core of my work as a historian has continued pretty much as it was, but I'd say that layered on top of my teaching job and research job is the felt need for 2 types of advocacy. One, to build strong relationships with the many non-Jewish colleagues and seniors inside my small institutional world, and 2, to make our Canadian Jewish story better known, better understood, and more connected with stories of both non-Jewish Canadians and of non-Canadian Jews. I know that some Jews have withdrawn from Jewish community life altogether, feeling overwhelmed or abandoned. Of course, there are Canadian Jews who have distanced themselves from Israel, finding the binds of identity too fraught or too exposed in the current climate. I'd venture, though, that a plurality of Canadian Jews find themselves trapped in the cultural crossfire of the right-left political wars, in which Jewish safety often seems like a secondary or instrumental concern. And then there's life in the era of 2.0 Trump. Well, there's a truism out there that Canadians are different only by virtue of being North Americans who are not American. And I actually think that this has some profound depth to it. And it looks to be all the more true when we witness America changing. These days, Canadians are quite vocal about distinguishing themselves from their closest neighbor, whose government they have to ponder uncomfortably may not just be imperfect allies or crappy neighbors, but even enemies. Canadian Jews are becoming more Canadian alongside their non-Jewish Canadian counterparts, just as American Jews have no choice but to struggle with the changes afoot in the United States. Jewish history teaches this point repeatedly, that in good times and in rotten ones, so long as Jews aren't identified as internal enemies of some great and awful power, we, will share the fate of our non-Jewish fellow nationals more than we'll share the fate of our Jewish brethren in countries that are not our own. The recent surge of Canadian civic pride in response to Trump's tariff blitzes and his annexationist threats have also awakened something potent in the national psyche here. A rare unifying clarity, perhaps, that Canada wants no part of the American disorder. Trump's menacing talk of forcing Canada to become the 51st state has really done a number on Canadians. In a matter of mere weeks this past spring, Canadians seem to have doubled down on the virtues of sovereignty, moderation, and cooperative governance. As Trump's rhetoric and his government's policies continue to rewrite the basic terms of US-Canada relations, which of course have been stable for many decades, Canadians across the political spectrum rediscovered a collective sense of purpose, national pride, and a renewed investment in the idea that we are not and will not be basically Americans, just with different accents and chocolate bars and national symbols. Canada ran a serious, sober, and wonderfully uneventful electoral process that focused on policy and platform in just 36 days this past March and April. Canadians were more deeply engaged in policy debates during the campaign than in any other election I can remember. About 70% of the electorate voted, which was the largest turnout rate since 1993. And lots of interesting things happened, but I wanted to point out what didn't. There was no talk about election fraud, none about the possibility of refuting certifications. Voters weren't refused at the polls. In fact, the system was at pains to make it easy for as many people as possible to get to ballot boxes. The reporting wasn't distorted by huge amounts of disinformation. The election process had few of the shenanigans of recent US elections that have been, frankly, so freaky and anxious for Canadians to watch from this side of the border. So those older markers of Canadian identity, pluralism, civility, a preference for cooperation over confrontation, particularly in the face of a unifying new national threat, well, these have gained new urgency. And in my reading anyway, the process of the recent federal election experience seems to have consolidated Canadians' commitments to good governance. The outcome of that election was also extraordinary and instructive. In most elections of the past 50 years, Canadians have usually split their votes unevenly between 5 different parties that then need to form formal coalitions in order to govern sometimes. Well, this past spring, voters significantly narrowed the set of issues to debate because it seemed to many that nothing short of national unity or even our national existence in the face of a serious crisis born of MAGA was at stake. Voters who would typically have voted for the New Democratic Party or the Green Party or the Bloc Québécois Party basically loaned their votes to one of the 2 largest parties, the Liberals or the Conservatives. The winner, now Prime Minister Mark Carney of the Liberal Party, is the most centrist leader the party could have possibly chosen, so much so that he easily could have chosen and been chosen to lead the Conservative Party with virtually identical rhetoric and policy goals. This is really instructive too. The idea that a major American political party could call itself the Progressive Conservatives sounds oxymoronic. But in Canada, it was the party that captured approximately 40% of the popular vote from 1942 to 2003, and one that served as the governing party for 17 of those years. For all the border and sovereignty drama has wrought upon Canadians, it's also brought an unexpected opportunity for Canadian Jews in particular. Reawakened Canadian nationalism has, it seems to me, created a really important civic opening into which Canadian Jews can and should reinvest in the national project, not defensively but assertively. This is a good time to affirm that our historical contributions to Canadian pluralism, and justice, and culture have been and remain essential part of this country's identity and its fabric, and that anti-Semitism is as un-Canadian as any other form of group animus, no more and no less. The same civic instincts that served Canadian Jews well under multiculturalism are now assets in a national moment that prizes unity against external threats. I'm thinking about a faith in institutions, a willingness to work across difference, and a devotion to law and to compromise. The extent to which Canadian Jewry can align our particular communal needs with this broader surge of civic pride could achieve at least 3 noble goals. It can shore up our security needs and our eagerness to feel recognized and included in a project that most of us share and value. The extent to which we Jews participate in the pro-Canadian parts of this new pro-Canada moment will also give us some agency in shaping Canada's next chapter. And thirdly, it may also provide the unexpected call that I have been eager to hear, the call for Canadian Jews to know themselves better as Canadian Jews. So despite all the turbulence, the fragmentation and fear, all of which I feel deeply and quite sharply, I believe Canadian Jewry holds a profound strength that we've yet to fully tap, one that I've already been describing. Our deep, long-standing but rarely articulated, almost unconscious commitment to what we might think of simply as centrism. As a practical stance, centrism simply represents a politics of moderation, pragmatism, and nuance. And if my reading of Canadian Jewish history is right, it's the stance that actually dominated Canadian Jewish life for generations. It reflects our geographic sprawl, our experience as a minority among minorities, our comfort with compromise, and our historical consciousness of vulnerability. Centrism is also deeply Canadian. It's a product of our cold, wide spaces, the shared reliance on public goods, and the culture of peace, order, and good government that we rarely trumpet, but intuitively hold dear and value as the cornerstone of our diverse community's security. Of course, Canadian Jews have always been spread out on a wide spectrum of political ideologies, from radical left to hard right, and now is no different. Canadian Jews are far from being monolithic, not religiously, not ethnically, not linguistically, and certainly not ideologically. But I think there is and always has been a wide middle range that captures a significant majority, and that it's helpful to think of it as centrist. Centrism here is not about indecision or blandness. It's a strategic, values-driven orientation, a recognition that minority communities survive and even thrive not by retreating into isolation, nor by warring over ideological orthodoxies, but instead by carefully and deliberately cultivating a shared civic space. I like the language that Yair Zivan uses with respect to centrism in Israel. Zivan is Yair Lapid's diplomatic advisor, and he champions this exact sort of centrism in his deeply compelling book, The Center Must Hold, about Israel. This centrist impulse has structured Canadian Jewish life in ways large and small. It animated the Canadian Jewish Congress of old, which invested tremendous energy in building broad consensuses around hate speech laws, around anti-discrimination policies, support for pluralistic democracy. And I think this impulse still continues today, even if it's a little less visible, in the way our communities organize themselves around education and philanthropy and cultural production. There are challenges and challengers to Canadian Jewish centrism, of course. Canadian Jews are hardly unified, and polarization, which is a cultural process that has political outcomes, is a serious threat. But we are not radically polarized. It might be helpful to keep in mind that the words liberal and conservative are also adjectives and not just nouns that capture certain kinds of people or distinct political ideologies. Because for something like 2 centuries before World War II, these adjectives were used to modify or to characterize people's attitudes towards capital L liberalism. Those who wanted the liberal order and liberal values to expand were liberal because they wanted liberalism to be applied liberally or generously in policy terms. On the other hand, those who were focused on preserving the fundamental elements of liberalism and who worried that if liberalism expanded too quickly, it would lose its core values were conservative because they preferred to conserve liberalism's most essential elements. So, centrism is just straight up the middle liberalism. It is, by definition, the least divisive and the most inclusive form of non-illiberalism. And we sure can use as much inoculation against illiberalism as we can get. So, as enervating and agitating as the last few years have been for Canadian Jews, talking strict COVID-19 lockdowns, a post-October 2023 reality, and Trump reactionism, I see opportunity for greater Canadian Jewish self-possession. I think we need to study ourselves more deeply, our peculiar histories, our internal diversities, our governance protocols, our national and regional specificities, and our communal allocation strategies. We're in desperate need of more and better data on what Canadian Jews believe, on how we're changing, and on where we stand vis-a-vis our neighbors. We could use a bespoke Canadian Jewish curricula in our day schools. Our civic and rabbinic leaders should continue to forge ties with other ethnic and religious leaders in their cities and neighborhoods to do better work in our municipal politics. I would love to see a state-of-the-art Canadian Jewish museum with public-facing educational programming to tell grand stories of this incredible, complex, and unique experiment in modern Jewish life. We need, in sum, both national and local initiatives that cultivate pride in who we are, not just in terms of our ongoing and deep commitments to our religious lives and the Holocaust and Israel, but intimately tied to our Canadianness. Pride in and knowledge about Canadian Jewish cultural production, political activism, intellectual achievements, and social contributions. I've been thrilled to see some new investments in Jewish leadership development in Canada for leaders who understand both Jewish particularity and Canadian pluralism. Leaders who can navigate the complexities of reconciliation and EDI, who can forge alliances without abandoning Jewish specificity, who can counter anti-Semitism without succumbing to bitterness or siege mentality. The vertical alliances that we've effectively maintained remain vitally important, but we'd be wise to also build horizontal alliances anew, to reinvest in municipal politics, to show up for and engage with non-Jewish cultural and social organizations, to forge ties with other religious and ethnic communities. We need to be the good neighbors to others that we want them to be for us, despite our sometimes warranted and sometimes unwarranted anxiety that we're not wanted. We must also ensure that our Canadian turn inward help guide our Jewish turn inward. The extent to which we see our Jewish values and vulnerabilities in terms that are relatable to other Canadians will speak to the community we'd like to see thrive here in the decades to come. At the risk of sounding jingoistic, I'm thinking that we'd be wise to reclaim Canadian pride in a way that asserts the basic and positive Canadian values of pluralism, democracy, and mutual responsibility. We already have a great track record of building a polity that honors both individual rights and collective responsibilities, both minority protections and civic unity. We'd be wise, in other words, to leverage our inherited strengths, our pragmatism, our flexibility, our cautious optimism, and turn them into active strategies for renewal. Now's the time, I think, to double down on ourselves, both as Jews and as Canadians. Look, we're in a strange moment here, and nobody can predict the future. My own conviction is that if we succeed in creating a Canadian Jewish future rooted in knowledge, pride, solidarity, pragmatism, and hope, we will not only strengthen Canadian Jewry in the process of strengthening the Canada itself that we want, we might end up also offering a model to the wider world of how a small, diverse, vulnerable but venerable community can thrive in a time of dislocation, distrust, and change. This vision, should something like it take hold, might also serve as a beacon for other Jewries worldwide, communities that might take their own two inward turns, both towards Jewish pride and towards their good neighbors, to find common cause with a simple, caring, and sober political and social culture. We're not the only ones who are fed up with polarization, weaponization, and the prioritization of anything other than the we, the collective we, who just want to get on with the business of living good lives.
We've been listening to David Koffman's reflection, Two Inward Turns, Canadian Jews Since Multiculturalism, Since October 8th, and Since Trump's Annexationist Threat. We'll link to the original written piece published in Sources in our show notes. Thanks, David, and thanks, Claire, for being with us and for making meaningful space for Canadian voices in the most important Jewish conversations of today. This episode of Tête-à-Tête was produced and edited by Theodora Draper. Original music is by J.K. Bradley. Our executive producers are David Koffman and Joshua Tapper. You can find links to this episode and all episodes of this podcast on the ACJS website, acjs-aejc.ca. There, you'll also find information about all the other interesting things our colleagues at the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies are up to, and to sign up for our occasional Substack newsletter to stay apprised of what's going on, to read special features, and hear about upcoming episodes of Tête-à-Tête. I encourage you to take a moment to subscribe and like our content wherever you get your podcasts. These digital gestures really do help podcasts like ours reach the wider audiences they're meant for. And if you feel so inspired, please share Tête-à-Tête with anyone you think might be interested in being part of the Canadian Jewish conversation. I'm Jonathan Slater, and on behalf of the ACJS and the team here at Tête-à-Tête, Shana Tova, and may 5786 be a good and sweet year for you. Thanks for joining us.